So right now in the UK, we're in the football off-season, which means there's no competitive football for us to watch, and I'm really missing it. Fortunately, we have the Women's Euros to keep us occupied this summer, but that doesn't last that long. I want something that's going to take me through the entire summer. And there's one league in particular that I've really started to enjoy watching, the MLS. Now recently the MLS has been making headlines with Gareth Bale signing for LAFC, and of course that brings out the usual cries of the MLS is just a retirement league. Well, I'm here today to tell you that you shouldn't be sleeping on the MLS because there are some really great talented young players coming through, and I genuinely think within the next decade the MLS is going to be a breeding ground of really great unique talent. But don't just take my word for it, because today I have got Captain America himself, Christian Pulisic's biggest stan, Zealand, to have a discussion with me about the MLS and the youth development going on in the space.
Look, Americans have a lot of pride when it comes to sports, which is why we really supported the women's national team before we supported the men's national team, because they win, right? It's why we really care about the Olympics and all those other. We're not used to losing. Once we started getting heat for it's a retirement league and nobody wants to play there and whatever, then it's kind of like we'll show you. And the way the MLS did that was they created these complex rules, which make the league, in my opinion, borderline unplayable in Football Manager and creates glitches all the time. And it's a nightmare for FIFA, who hates the draft and everything. But what those rules did was they limited, because what does the US always have? The US has a ton of money, right? So if you own a club, you're going to want to just put butts in the seats and build a team that can win now. I mean, this is the issue everybody runs into. So they limited your ability to do that. With a salary cap, you can sign 3 players that don't count against the salary cap. You can sign a 4th player under a certain age that doesn't count against the salary cap. You pay them. Well, they do count. They count as the most expensive player under the salary cap, but you can pay them a lot more. So they limited that, and they really emphasized with a lot of different homegrown rules trying to grow your players. And that combined with what I describe as the boom of soccer, which is essentially my generation, where the Premier League was on every weekend and FIFA became arguably the most popular video game in the entire country. All of a sudden, everybody's interested in the sport. And everybody was already playing it to begin with. They just stopped at a certain point. But now that the MLS was really driving this youth movement, it combined with an increase in interest and just produced this wave of players that's kind of washing over the Bundesliga and now seemingly Leeds United.
Definitely, and I feel like the MLS are putting more parameters in place to enable these MLS clubs to develop their youngsters. You've got the MLS Next, which is that's like the under-19, under-17 leagues, right?
Yeah, it's a youth team league. They actually stream the games on Twitch. If you ever wanted
That's
to watch,
really cool.
The commentary is spotty sometimes, but they stream the games on Twitch, and you can watch these kids play. You judge the standard for yourself, right?
That's pretty cool, yeah. And then I think it's a step up from that to the MLS Next Pro, which is like the second teams essentially, right? And then there's the Generation Adidas Cup and Generation Adidas sort of stuff. And is that more like big sponsors getting involved to try and boost young players' careers?
I mean, Adidas has always tried to position themselves as the soccer face in the United States. They were the first, the first set of soccer equipment I ever got was Adidas. All my friends had Adidas. I think they were trying to corner the market a while ago, and I'm not surprised they're still involved in sponsoring the youth tournaments. The youth system in the United States is still very convoluted compared to basically everywhere else in the world because of just the unique way that sports has developed in the U.S., and trying to jackknife soccer into that has been really awkward. And so you have the development of the youth leagues, you have the development of the reserve leagues, you have some reserve teams that play in the USL, which is, of course, the second tier and below. USL has created a 3-tiered system that they're basically ready to connect with the MLS whenever the MLS decides to go that route, which might not be anytime soon. But in some team, I know, I think Seattle Sounders have a team that just plays in the USL, and that's their other reserve team. And then you have the cups. And then some of the cups are pre-draft workouts for different people coming from college soccer, which is existing in its own world. So it gets really confusing quickly. I honestly probably don't understand exactly how every part of player development in the MLS works, and I live here.
Yeah, tricky to find the fine balance between what's best for the sport as a whole in a worldwide sense, but also what's best for the domestic audience who are not used to the rest of the world's approach to football and how it works, right?
We're used to franchises. We're used to players getting drafted. We're used to we're used to trades, not transfers, right? And when you're appealing to the normal American sporting sensibility, and so the MLS is trying to make itself more appealing in that way. We're not used to youth academies. We're not used to scouting and signing people from other countries. Is really a foreign concept in basically every sport, including hockey, because in hockey, those kids go through the draft too, whether you're from Russia, Sweden, Latvia, whatever.
I've highlighted a few players who in this past season have left the MLS to join Europe. And one of them is Ricardo Pepi, 19 years old, left Dallas to go to Augsburg. £15 million, not quite sure what that works to in dollars, but it's the second biggest transfer out of the MLS ever, behind Almiron to Newcastle, right? Like, that's huge news for the MLS and the way it's developing players, right?
It was huge news. It was also huge news for the US. So, because Ricardo Pepi was born in El Paso. And El Paso is one of the most unique cities in the United States, and especially in a soccer sense, because El Paso is a sister city. It is on the border with Mexico, and its sister city is Juarez. And so when you live in El Paso, you essentially live in both Mexico and the United States. Like, it's half the city, and the other half the city's on the other side of the border. So he had a huge decision to make about who to play for initially. And he goes to Dallas. And then he had a huge decision to make about who to play for again nationally. And he picked the United States, which was, massive. And then he was the first sign of a hype train player. I actually don't know how good he's going to end up being, but he showed up in the national team and scored in his debut, and then scored again. And so everybody's going nuts, right? That this kid's the second coming. He's scoring like 1 goal a game at Dallas.
Saying that though, like, he's 19 years old. He's just joined the Bundesliga. He's made 17 appearances in the 17 games that he was there this end of the season for Augsburg, right? Which is not a bad return. I mean, he's not scored a goal in that time as a striker. It's not ideal, right? But like, he's getting the minutes. He's playing frequently in a top 5 European league. Like, I think that shows good progress, that he's just been able to move across, hit the ground running, and do pretty well. And I think someone who's maybe a bit more of a better example of that is Gianluca Busio, right? 20 years old, moved from Kansas to Venezia, $5.5 million, and yes, Venezia got relegated this past season. But when you look at his stats, when you compare it to players who have played a similar amount of games and minutes, he's played nearly 2,000 minutes across the season. Comparing that with other players in his position in the top 5 leagues, he's in the 99th percentile for blocks, 87th percentile for pressures, 75th percentile for tackles. Like, I feel like he's really hit the ground running.
Busio is a stud. He's part of this secondary wave of players. So there's the initial wave, which was essentially Weston McKennie, Tyler Adams, Christian Pulisic coming through the Dortmund Academy because he was able to get a Croatian passport through like his grandfather, I think, and Gio Reyna coming through at Dortmund as well. That's the first wave, and then the second wave is guys like Busio and Pepi, where they are now being found because people are looking at the MLS. I really think that's a serious contributing factor to this. Because there are guys, and one of the names that comes to mind for me is a guy like Sasha Kleshton, who plays for Orlando now, that were really good and played at a high level, but they don't, and I think he's got a couple appearances for the U.S. national team, right? He was doing well in the MLS, but nobody was really looking for talented MLS players at that time. And so now that they're looking, they find people like Busio. And he's fantastic. And he is probably a better sign than Ricardo Pepi that the United States can produce players that are just ready to walk into a Serie A team and play at a very good level.
I think there's going to be a bit more of a trend of, like you say, there's people now looking at the MLS in particular. And there's a current generation of kids in the MLS who I think are fantastic. Some of them are, the homegrown talents. They are starting to bring in a few more players from abroad as well. Thiago Almada, £13 million to Atlanta. Brenner Cincinnati was bought for £10.5 million. Facundo Torres, Orlando bought him for £6 million. But I think the player that both we were talking about before we started recording was Tez Magno, right, at New York City FC. Vasco da Gama, they bought him from there, £6.5 million, and he's just flourished, right?
Well, he was a wonder kid in Football Manager before New York City got their hands on him. I was surprised they got him for as cheap as they did. Vasco da Gama, I guess, just felt like taking the money and running. Maybe they needed it for something else. I'm not up with the Brazilian league, but Thales Magno is a stud. They won the MLS Cup, and he played all the way through that. He was a feature player winning the MLS Cup at 19 and he endeared himself immediately to New York. He's just a really good player. And it's surprising because now he's somebody that you could see being included on lists of like the top 50 Wonderkids in the world, right? And he's Brazilian, right? He's the type of Wonderkid that you should be finding playing at Palmeiras, who's like a year or two away from maybe taking the step over to Sevilla or maybe even Barcelona if he plays well enough. But instead of staying there and developing, he's in New York, and now he's playing in the City Group, which I'm sure was a contributing factor in him actually signing there in the first place. It's wild for me to wrap my brain around that, and it is obviously a good sign. Atlanta's at the forefront of developing very talented young players. They've put multiple players in top leagues. Almiron in particular at Newcastle's a guy that jumps off the page. He was balling it up at Atlanta for a couple years before he made that move.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing that, obviously these young kids are seeing America and the MLS as a place to go, and maybe Magno's seen it more as it's into the City Group, it's an into potentially Man City down the line. But another player that I really like, Alan Velasco, he moved to Dallas, right? And Dallas, as far as I'm aware, aren't linked or affiliated with any sort of major club in a top 5 European league or anything like that. Do you think there's more of a trend now as well in the MLS to actually sign these players and keep them for the road, rather than sign them, develop them, sell them? There is more of a sign them, make them stars, keep them.
I think that there is a line, and this is the line that you walk in any league from the Netherlands to Portugal, where a player like Bruno Fernandes crosses that line, and all of a sudden you go, well, we just can't keep him anymore. And so your ideal player in those leagues are the guys that get Joseph Martinez at Atlanta. They get really good, but they're not great. And so you're signing players either, like when you sign somebody like Velasquez, right? You sign a player and you're going, okay, either he turns into somebody we flip for a lot of money because he becomes great, or he becomes really good and we can hang on to him for a long time. The MLS is hard to win. There's a lot of teams. You got the playoffs, there's a lot of drama, a lot of different things going on. U.S. Open Cup is a separate dance. Pretty straightforward cup competition, actually. But the MLS Cup is hard to win with the salary cap and everything. But if you can get a team identity, and Portland does a really good job of this, Seattle does a really good job of this, Atlanta does a really good job of this, getting a team identity wrapped around 4 or 5 guys that are always there. Even if you're having to make changes because the salary cap or because you don't think the team's going to be as good this year, you have those guys that can stay there. So if you're signing a wonder kid, you're New York signing Magno, you're Dallas signing Velasquez, you're Atlanta signing Thiago Almada, either that guy's going to move for more money or you keep him and he becomes one of the identity pieces of your team that people can relate to. I think that the MLS is looking to create that now, but I don't want to give the false impression that the MLS is ever going to be able to hang on to like a U.S. men's national team starting player, because they're just not.
Yeah, and speaking of that, there's obviously a whole new generation coming through that are potentially going to be world class. I think one of the players right at the forefront of that is Gabriel Slonina, right? Here, the goalkeeper from Chicago Fire. He's 18 years old, but is their first choice keeper. And despite conceding 22 goals in 17 appearances so far this
Chicago's
season.
Terrible.
Chicago are terrible, right? He has also kept 7 clean sheets, but he's played 1,530 minutes so far this season, which is mental for an 18-year-old.
He's sensational. I tweeted out a save that he made that I did one of the best saves I've seen just scrolling through Twitter. It's stupid. The balance, the technique, and then just the raw, kind of reaction. And to have all of that together in somebody who's 18. And just the comfort. I mean, you can look at the MLS and go, well, it's not as big as the Premier League. It's not as big as the Bundesliga. You're still playing away to Atlanta. There's 70,000 people there, right? It's loud. They're not happy, right, that you are there. And just to have the experience when you're that age, to be able to play in those environments and hold your own and not have the coach say, well, we're not starting him today. I'm always impressed by that. And that's what I think is the most important takeaway from these guys that happen to play at that age. And especially as a goalkeeper, because it's so much about managing your nerves in that situation. The moments you're involved in the match are the most important. And so he's getting that experience in a league that's more intense than ever, and he's a stud. And I think Chelsea was looking at him, and a bunch of different teams have been, quote unquote, looking at him. I think he's going to move probably at the end of the year because he is the U.S. national team goalkeeper of the future. He's got that Tim Howard potential. He could be a 10, 12-year starter for a top club in the world. Not Real Madrid. I'm not saying that, right? I don't think he's Thibaut Courtois, but I mean, if he popped up at Sevilla or if he popped up at Leicester and became their goalie for the next 12 years, I wouldn't be surprised at all. He's that good.
But there's one player who I guess has got like untapped potential so far. No one knows how good he's going to get, right? Because he's only 16 years old. But Obed Vargas, right? You were talking about him earlier on. Yeah. Already got caps for the under-20 national team, despite being only just 16, right? Like, how far do you reckon he could go?
I'll be honest, I don't really remember a player not just playing in a game, but being influential in a game under the age of 17 in the MLS since Alphonso Davies. I'm not, wow. Different types of players, right? He's more of a midfielder. But the last time I remembered watching somebody that was under the age of 17 that was just not, they weren't just there. Right, and it's more than impressive to be 16 and be there, right? Just be able to be one of the guys. But to watch the game and then see somebody that is influencing the game. He played in I believe he played in the CONCACAF Champions League final. So he played in the Continental Champions League final for Seattle at 16. He came off the bench and was actually very important in that game. I hope he chooses the U.S. because he's an interesting case. So his parents are from Mexico, and he was born in Anchorage, Alaska. And so we're talking about just a very unique human experience that Obed Vargas has had, and then moved to the Seattle Academy, I think at 13. So 3 years playing not at some local team in Anchorage is all he's had to improve. And he's already at a level where he can take the field in the Champions League final and CONCACAF and actually influence the game positively for his team.
Obviously, tons of other great talents in the MLS. Off the top of my head, I can think of John Tolkien and Jaden Nelson, both really good young players. But as you were mentioning the Champions League, right, I think this is a good way to sort of round up the video. The MLS is improving. There's some really good young players coming through. When I think Europeans think of North American football, it instantly goes to the Mexican League, Liga MX, and the quality of players they've got there. Do you think the MLS is on the same level as Liga MX right now, or do you think it's better?
Yeah, I think that the wage structure is so different. I said this recently in a stream where I think this might have been something we just talked about before we got on, but it was I don't want the U.S. League to be like the Mexican League. Right, the Mexican League has no wage structure or anything, so the wages are huge. The players have no incentive to leave unless it's for a huge club that's going to pay them a couple million a year at least. And in the U.S., you could have that, but I don't want that because the wage structure in the U.S. pushes players out of the MLS in kind of this ingenious way where they know they could make more money, and so then they force a move to Europe. That's why they leave. That's why Adams and McKinney, it is because they're not making millions of dollars in the MLS. You make like $500,000 a year, and if you're one of the designated players, you can make whatever you want, but often you won't spend that on an 18-year-old. And I think the U.S. League I think the MLS is better than the Mexican League. Right now, we own the Champions League, right? And it's been a lot of parity for years between the two leagues. Toronto made the final a couple years ago and lost on penalties, and there's one or two other teams in CONCACAF, like Saprissa from Costa Rica, that can get to a quarter or semifinal, but it really is just Mexico and the U.S. battling it out with the best clubs. And I think the U.S. League is, at worst, really leveling out with the Mexican League, but has potential to continue to grow because the U.S. hasn't unlocked its wage structure yet. The salary caps are still very strict, where the Mexican League is... It gets kind of the European equivalent is the Russian league, where the wages and the money is so big that it's hard. You feel like that should be a good thing, but it ends up being a bad thing, where no Russian players leave the Russian league. And on Football Manager, if you're playing and you're trying to sign a Russian player, you had this experience. Or a Chinese player is a worse example. Mexico is like that, and the U.S. is more like Brazil or Argentina, where players do look to move on when they're good enough. But at the same time, the league has clearly grown to a level where the average MLS team can totally beat the average Mexican team, and there is an incredible amount of parity between the two leagues. And I actually like the way we're set up better to help our national team and help our brand abroad, because if you name the Mexican national team, half that starting 11 is in the Mexican league, and you don't really know who they are. But if you talk about the U.S. national team, you know who more of those guys are, and they're getting more exposure and more playing time on bigger stages.
So I think what we're saying basically is that the MLS has got so much potential to grow. And in this next decade, this coming up, especially with the new Apple deal, right, with the MLS, it's like global TV coverage, right, isn't it? So literally anyone on the globe can sign to Apple TV or whatever package they're going to do. That's going to bring a whole ton more exposure to the MLS as well. I think we're at the conclusion that the MLS is class. There's some really good young players in there. It's developing quickly, and it's got quite a big future ahead of it.
It's a good league. I've been saying this it's not. I'm not unrealistic about, I think the Dutch league is better. I think the Portuguese league is better. But I think if you wanted to slot the MLS somewhere in the top 10 European leagues, like just kind of, the Celtic and Rangers are almost certainly better teams, but you wanted to put it on the same level as the Scottish league in general, I think you could. It's definitely behind Brazil and Argentina. I don't think there's any other league in South America that is got a clear argument to say that they're better than the MLS either. So we're getting up to the level of, we're one step behind Brazil and Argentina, but if we can clear that last hurdle, that's where we're trying to get to. But the MLS is legitimately a good league now. It's not a hodgepodge of try-hard Americans combined with overpaid fat cats that are 35 from Europe. It is career guys that make a career in the league, that have 7 or 8 appearances for the U.S. national team. It's Wonderkids, not just from the U.S., but really from the whole Western Hemisphere. I wonder if we're ever going to see, people from different continents outside of North and South America that get signed to MLS teams more regularly. But it's just a fun league to watch. Now, the quality is high enough and the fan investment is high enough that it's just an engaging product to watch. Like, just watch, the highlights from any given weekend and you'll enjoy it.
Well, Zealand, thank you very much for your time, and I think you've helped convince everyone that the MLS is something to watch this summer without any European football.
Yeah, especially with the opposite league. Why not?
So hopefully we've convinced you that the MLS is worth spending some time and watching this summer, particularly for the young players which you can scout to sign for your football manager saves. I know that's my biggest priority in life. So let me know down in the comment section if you're going to watch some MLS and what you think of it, and also make sure you subscribe to my channel and to Zealand's channel, and a big thanks to him for coming on to do this video with me. Until next time, have a good one. Goodbye.